Renowned cardiologist Pim van Lommel has written a book based on his interviews with hundreds of heart patients at his hospital who had all clinically died of cardiac arrest before being resuscitated. A significant percentage of these patients reported a near-death experience. The evidence Dr. van Lommel has gathered supports the validity of the near-death experience and suggests that scientists should rethink their theories on the nature of human consciousness. Dr. van Lommel offers a new paradigm for the 21st century that could change the way we view death and how we live our lives. Dr. van Lommel, thank you so much for inviting me here for this interview.
You're welcome.
Now, I'd like to begin by asking, I imagine that you can empathize with scientists and physicians who adhere to a strictly materialistic paradigm because you were one of those yourself at one time. So how did your orientation begin to change?
Yeah. Well, I'm a cardiologist, so I had the privilege to have patients who survived cardiac arrest. And after reading a book about near-death experiences by George Ritchie, Return from Tomorrow, who had a near-death experience as a medical student in '43, I just started out of curiosity to ask patients who survived a cardiac arrest if they could remember something of this period of unconsciousness. And then, to my big surprise, within 2 years, out of 50 patients I asked, 12 patients told me about the near-death experience.
Uh-huh.
And that's the moment my scientific curiosity started to grow, because according to our current medical knowledge, it's impossible to experience consciousness during cardiac arrest when circulation and breathing have ceased. So this is how it started for me.
Were you comfortable expressing your curiosity to your fellow physicians?
Well, a lot of physicians are not open for it.
Why not?
Some, because it doesn't fit in the concept we've learned. And also I have learned as a medical student and as a young doctor that we have the assumption, which shouldn't be discussed, that consciousness is a product of the function of the brain. So that's the reason it's impossible to experience consciousness when you have a cardiac arrest.
But is there any scientific evidence that consciousness is produced by the brain?
No, it's a non-proven assumption. It's just an hypothesis, but everybody accepts it because most people have the experience that you experience consciousness when you're awake.
Mm-hmm. So scientists who stress the scientific method and the controlled experiment have based their ideas about consciousness on an assumption.
Yes. Well, most scientific assumption, research starts with assumptions and then you try to prove it.
Mm-hmm.
And as long as neuroscientists see activities in neuroimaging techniques, they believe that they see something which could be the consciousness.
Right. Why is a cardiac arrest so important in the study of the near-death experience?
Well, it's important because there are many circumstances when people can report a near-death experience. But when you have survivors of cardiac arrest who tell you about an enhanced consciousness with cognition, with emotions, with memories, etc., also with the possibility of perception out and above the life of the body, then we know that this enhanced consciousness paradoxically occurs during the moment that patients are deep unconscious and when the brain is not functioning. So this challenges the assumption that consciousness is a product of the functioning brain.
Mm-hmm. When you began to hear these stories about people telling you what happened during a period of the so-called unconsciousness, what one item from the near-death experience impressed you the most?
Well, each patient who were willing to share their experience with me is emotional, is impressive. It's honest, it's reluctance, it's emotion. They cannot believe in themselves, and they try to find words for it. And so it's when you talk to patients who are willing to share the experience, it's always impressive.
Tell us what a near-death experience is.
Yeah, well, the near-death experience for me is the reported memory of all impressions during a period of an enhanced consciousness, a special state of consciousness with specific universal elements like out-of-body experience, a tunnel, a light, a life review, or meeting deceased relatives, or meeting a border. So these kind of elements have always been reported during all times, all religions, and all mankind.
What are the major objections to reports of the near-death experience from people with a scientific orientation? What are the major objections to the possibility of a near-death experience? Why do they say that this is not possible?
Well, it's because of the assumption that the consciousness is a product of the function of the brain. And there have been a lot of retrospective studies done, and there was still people believed that the explanation of the cause, the content of an NDE, was just lack of oxygen, or the fear of death, or medication, or hallucination, or whatever. And so it doesn't fit in our current medical concepts that it is possible.
So according to most scientists who specialize in consciousness research, consciousness arises entirely from the matter that comprises the brain. Therefore, our consciousness is nothing other than the expression of a machine controlled by classical physics and chemistry, and our behavior is the outcome of nerve cell activity in the brain. What this means is, isn't it true that there's no free will and we're essentially robots?
If they would be right, then there would be no free will, and consciousness is just an illusion.
Yet there is evidence that consciousness can control the brain?
Yes, this what is called neuroplasticity. That is, that the function and the structure of the brain can change due to changes in consciousness, which is well known, like say in placebo effect. When you receive medication, a placebo medication for depression, or for pain, or for Parkinson's disease, then you not only see the clinical improvement of those patients, but when you do neuroimaging technique, you see those centers who are involved in pain or depression or in Parkinson's disease are also improved. So you see changes in the brain due to the concept that people believe that they are treated. And also in mindfulness training or in meditation, long-term meditation, you see changes in the brain due to these techniques. So changes in consciousness give rise to change and function and structure of the brain.
Your study was significant because many of the reports of near-death experiences were retrospective, and yet your study is progressive. Why is the progressive approach to the near-death experience more significant?
It's called prospective.
Prospective, I'm sorry.
Prospective. Prospective study is that you, what we did in the Dutch study, we started in '88, with all 344 consecutive patients who survived a cardiac arrest. So you have a medical situation, which is cardiac arrest. And from this position, you ask patients if they have experienced something. When you have a retrospective study, then you ask patients if they would, by advertisement of after lectures, if they would come to you and tell about their death experience. But you never know who will come and who will not come. People are not able to talk about the experience, will not come. So there's an enormous amount of selection of patients when you do retrospective studies. And you cannot find out what really the medical circumstances were when it was 20 or 30 years ago. So in this prospective study with cardiac arrest, we know exactly that patients were clinical death, which is period of unconsciousness due to the ceasing of circulation and breathing. And all those patients will die within 5 to 10 minutes if resuscitation is not started. So they are in the beginning of the process of dying. And if you do not resuscitate those patients, they will die within 5 to 10 minutes because of irreversible brain damage. So this is a kind of situation where you know exactly what's going on in the brain. And in these circumstances, you can really look after, you can put all the medical documents, you can ask patients about the psychological factors, you can see what medication we're giving, etc. So you can look after all the factors who could explain the cause and content of an NDE.
So this must have puzzled you. Well, how is consciousness possible during a period in which a person has experienced cardiac arrest? And from your book, I see that you cited the 2005 Journal of Science, which published a special anniversary issue featuring 125 questions that scientists have so far failed to answer. The number one question that scientists have failed to answer is, what is the universe made of? Followed by the number two question, what is the biological basis of consciousness? And in your book you said that you would reformulate this question to, does consciousness have a biological basis at all? So where did this question lead you?
Well, first, why did they ask this question? This is because of the result of our study. Because what we found in our prospective study of the 344 patients, that 62 patients, 80%, reported a near-death experience, and 282 patients, 82%, did not report a memory. Maybe compare these two groups, there was no difference at all in the duration of cardiac arrest, 2 minutes or 8 minutes, or the duration of unconsciousness, 5 minutes or 3 weeks in coma, or the given medication, or fear of death before the arrest, or foreknowledge that you know that it is possible that you can have this kind of experience, or gender, or education, or religion. So what was so striking and surprising for us, that there is no explanation whatsoever why those 18% of the people have a near-death experience. There's no physiological explanation. So the lack of oxygen to the brain is not an explanation at all, because all those 100% of those patients had anoxia of the brain, lack of oxygen. There's no pharmacological explanation because the medication had no influence at all. There was no psychological explanation. So we came to the conclusion that there is no explanation, well-known explanation, why people have this experience. But the experience is enhanced consciousness during a period of cardiac arrest when the brain is not functioning. So the second thing for us was, how do we know that the brain doesn't function? And then afterwards, when you have those answers, you can ask the question, is there a biological basis anyway for consciousness?
I see. So where did that question lead you?
Yeah. But to first tell you that we know that the brain doesn't function, because I think that's important.
Okay. All right.
And then you come to the conclusion, because first you have to scientifically prove that the brain doesn't function. Because there's a lot of scientists, materialistic scientists as well, it is as if a patient is unconscious during cardiac arrest, but when they report consciousness, then they must have been conscious. So the brain must have been working somewhere, because they keep on the concept, the assumption, that consciousness is a product of the brain. So when you can prove that the brain is not functioning, then you can discuss the never proven assumption that consciousness is a product of the brain. So we know from some studies with induced cardiac arrest in people and also in animals, that when you induce cardiac arrest, for instance, when you do an implantation of ICDs, internal defibrillators, then you have induced cardiac arrest to do testing that you are sure that it is functioning. Then you see that within 1 second the blood flow to the brain is 0. People are unconscious within 1 or 2 seconds. The body reflexes are gone, which is a function of the cortex of the brain. The brainstem reflexes are gone. So the gag reflex or the corneal reflex or you see dilated pupils. The breathing center has gone, which is close to the brainstem, so people don't breathe anymore. And when you measure the activity of the brain, which is an EEG, you see after an average of 50 seconds a total flat line. So the clinical findings and what you can measure makes us aware that the brain doesn't function anymore after an average of 15 seconds. And we know in a well-organized coronary care unit, you need at least 60 to 120 seconds to do a successful resuscitation. Mostly it will be more. So we know from our study, 344 patients, that they all must have had a flatline EEG, and still they had an enhanced consciousness, more consciousness than the normal waking consciousness we have now. So this makes the conclusion: how is it possible?
Okay. How is it possible?
Well, we have to change our ideas about where consciousness comes from. And where you believe that consciousness is a product of the brain, it's impossible. So for me, the brain has a function of a transceiver. It receives information from consciousness, and it sends information from our senses and body to our consciousness. So it is a transceiver, it's an interface function. So the brain makes it possible, it facilitates the experience of waking consciousness when we are awake. But consciousness itself is not localized to the body and to the brain. It's non-local, which is when people tell us about their experience of an enhanced consciousness, and they have a live review of, let's say, during cardiac arrest of 2 minutes, they can talk for hours to days about what experience, because there's no time and no distance during this experience. You have each thought you ever had is kept, each word you have said, and each act you've done, with the influence on oneself or other you perceive. So this consciousness is in a dimension without time and space, and everything is connected. And this is what you call non-locality. So this is what I call non-local consciousness.
Right. Would it be appropriate to use the word spiritual to describe this state of non-locality? I know that many doctors, many scientists, when they hear this word, it's kind of the kiss of death to their profession. So, but it inevitably comes up. So, would you call these religious experiences, spiritual experiences? I know it gets into quantum territory, but could you?
Well, there are so many words which can be used for this kind of experience. They say experience of oneness. They say experience of unity, because everything is connected. They call it mystical experiences in the Middle Ages. It was called mystical experience, or enlightened experiences, of experience of life insight. So there are so many words used for this kind of ineffable experiences. And people change. And they also, and that's an important aspect, we can talk about it later, they have about 100% of those people within that have much more interest in spirituality than before. So there are
even atheists?
Even atheists. So it's independent of the religion beforehand that you changed. So it's the other aspect of the study we did. We had a prospective study, and we have a longitudinal or long-term study with interviews after 2 years and 8 years of all survivors of cardiac arrest, with a matched control group of patients who did not have an NDE, to see if there's a kind of transformation they changed. Is due to the cardiac arrest, or due to the NDE, because we didn't know. And we found that the transformation is just the result of the NDE.
Right. Dr. Van Lommel, at this point I'd like to ask you, as you were learning about the near-death experience and began to see that there was something very unusual going on here, what did this do to you personally?
Well, it has changed my insight in life and death. I think you can say that. And I always tell the people that the people with the death experience who were willing to share their experience with me have been my teachers, not only about the content of the NDE, but also about the transformation. They tell me there is no fear of, they don't have fear of death anymore. Death seemed to be not death at all. So there's a continuity of consciousness, and you see your body, lifeless body, somewhere down, and you feel alive. So, and they also tell me about the change of life inside. What is important in life is unconditional love and acceptance and compassion towards yourself and others and nature. And the third transformation is the enhanced intuitive sensibility, that they receive information not by your senses and your body, which is called I could call it scientific way non-local information exchange. Well, these kind of changes, as people share it with you, then you have to change all your concepts you had before, and I did.
Mm-hmm. When near-death experiencers talk about the importance of love, I imagine they were more ego-centered before this experience. So what is it about this experience that transforms someone from an ego-centered entity to a person who is genuinely concerned about the feelings of others?
Yeah. Well, it's because in this experience, especially when you have a life review, you experience that everything you do or think or act towards someone else is at last, during this experience, affecting yourself. You feel the distress you cause to others. You feel the love you gave to others. So everything you give to others will come back to yourself. Love as well as aggression. And when you're aware of this effect on others, because you're in a different way, you're in a higher level of consciousness, you're all one, you're always connected. Then you change the way you live, because you know now, you have an inner knowing that what you think even has effect on others. Mm-hmm. So what you do, so it's about also when you want to help your neighbor, because you want to be loved by your neighbor.
It's selfish motive.
It's selfish motive. It's wrong. But where you have the intention to help, mm-hmm. this is right. And this kind of insight they receive in this experience.
It must surprise you that during a life review, a person can see everything they've done and thought in their whole lives. And this brings up questions of the brain can't possibly be the storehouse of all these memories. So if we can kind of revisit a territory we've already gone through, I'm still perplexed about where these memories are stored.
Yeah. Well, they're not stored in the body like you said, they're not stored in the brain, because you have...
And that's shocking for scientists.
That's shocking for scientists. At least it is new for scientists, because we have always been thinking or believing that everything is stored in the brain. Mm-hmm. And you have real new thoughts, new emotions during this near-death experience, when the brain doesn't function at all. You have the possibility of perception out and above your body when the brain is not functioning. Mm-hmm. And this out-of-body experience can have veridical perception. So it's real. And what they...
Veridical meaning?
Veridical meaning that you can, but they tell what happened to the body during resuscitation is corroborated by doctors and nurses and family members. Mm-hmm. So they tell, I saw this and also this, and say, well, it's right, it happened really. And so you can also corroborate the moment it happened, and you know that it was happening in the middle, mm-hmm. somewhere of the resuscitation. Right. So everything they experience is at the moment that the brain doesn't function. Mm-hmm. So it must be somewhere else, and this is what I call the non-local consciousness, where everything is stored.
Right. And people can also see and hear. They can see without eyes, they can hear without ears, and I think there are reports of blind people who've been blind from birth who can see. So this is a great puzzle. How is that possible? I can imagine how it might be possible to have memories stored outside of the brain. That's a stretch, but it's possible to conceive of that. But how is it possible to see and hear without the organs by which we normally think that we see and hear things?
Yeah. Well, they don't hear, but they know the thoughts of people. So they don't hear voices, but they know what is said.
But they do see.
But they perceive.
Perceive.
I say perceive because it's not by your eyes. Your eyes are closed. And you perceive 360 degrees. You can see details and an overview at the same time. So it's a different kind of perception. And even blind people from birth can perceive. And I know people who have glasses, very strong glasses. They need to see something. And then I know a story of a woman who had a near-death experience, and she was perceiving everything what was going on during childbirth, and she nearly died. Loss of blood. And then at once she saw her own glasses down near her bed, and then she realized, I can see now clear. But normally without her glasses she couldn't see anything. It was just crazy. But you can also ask, who is perceiving when you're awake? Because there are electromagnetic informations in the light which comes to your retina in your eyes, and then you got electromagnetic information to your brain. But it is still information. So the question is, who is seeing? Who is transforming this kind of information, which is electromagnetic information in your brain, into a picture we can perceive? This is not your brain who is perceiving.
So how do you answer the question, who is perceiving it?
That's the essence of who we are. It is consciousness. Consciousness is perceiving.
And consciousness is non-local.
And non-consciousness is non-local.
For those of us who don't understand the concept of non-locality, could you explain that to us?
Yeah. So non-locality is a dimension where there is no time and no space. So no distance. So everything is there. When you have a life review, you have access to all information you had during your whole life. Each thought, each word, each act you did or had is kept with the effect on others. But you also can have a flash forward, a preview of things for the future. So in this dimension, the past, present, and future is available. And everything is connected. It's entangled, it's interconnected. So there's, it's an analogy to quantum physics, which is non-local, is connected without time and without space.